Good afternoon. This is Nancy Schick of Third Ear Conflict Resolution, and it is the third Thursday of the month. And in approximately 10 seconds, it will be 3 o'clock Eastern. So every month at 3 p.m. on the third Thursday, we do what I call Third Ear Thursday, this live webinar where we talk about various workplace disputes and how to resolve them. So last month, we started a conversation about me, you, and we. And I thought it was perfect to bring Jeannette Seibly in on this part of the conversation to carry that forward, because we are really talking about what I talk about all the time, which is building employment as a partnership. So, Jeannette, why don't you introduce yourself and we'll just go. We are going to have a conversation a little bit more than presenting. So let's talk.
Oh, I love that. And I love talking with you. So this is going to be a lot of fun. So I'm Jeannette Seibly. I'm out of Denver, Colorado. And the weather right here is kind of cold today. And I'm a talent advisor, leadership results coach, and have been for over 32 years. And I also have a lot of corporate experience and also assessments. So I have been doing that for over 32 years. I love the difference when you use the right assessment, the ahas that people just light up. But it also helps people when it comes to coaching, managing, and hiring their people and being effective and getting the results they need. Because too often, somewhere along the line, we forgot that results are important. And results could be just keeping clients or having them feel like, yes, you heard me and yes, you delivered. Yeah. It can be that simple, but it's not always that simple when you are hiring the wrong people.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you said that about we forget that we're really trying to achieve certain results, and that this is about what we're talking about is effective employment partnerships, because I think about that as well. And when I use that partnership word, it's to trigger this thinking, right? And well, I find a lot of my clients that end up in my office needing to resolve a dispute or dissolve a partnership, an actual business partnership or an employment partnership, that they had forgotten why they got in the relationship in the first place. And it's a mismatch. It doesn't mean, just like a personal partnership or a friendship, sometimes it just runs its course, right? And so I think that's the other reason I started using this as a demonstration of how we should be thinking about coming together, because employer and employee are both getting something from the relationship, ideally.
You're so right. So the next slide.
Yeah, so we are going to use these slides to drive the agenda a little bit, because Jeannette and I will talk all day long about employment and different things that we've seen and different types of ideas that we want to share. But for all of you listening, we want to make sure that you get something valuable. So we're going to talk today about something we've already led into, is why employment partnerships matter. Then how do you align goals? And when we're talking about aligning goals, we're talking about the business goal and the employee goal, but also recognizing if you're in what I call the sandwich generation in business, which is the manager, that you're having to be the go-between. So in a lot of ways, you're doing a job similar to mine, where you're trying to reconcile different interests and have people come together. And I highly respect that you have a tough job. And I know that's one of the reasons, Jeannette, that you work in that particular space, right? Is because that's probably one of the tougher jobs in any organization.
Yeah, working with bosses and leaders today, because a lot of them are getting a very bad rap. Some of it's deserved, but a lot of it is not. And I think through our conversation today, we're going to address some of those areas and how to prevent that. How we can help you, and you can help your clients, for those of you who are consultants and for those of you who are actually working directly in the business, how you can help each other become more aware of what you can do.
Yeah, and then we're going to talk a little bit about something you already mentioned, the assessments, right? I'm certified with a particular assessment, And I know you are certified and you use a different one. And I use it more as opening a conversation. So we'll talk about like how to use assessments, how not to use assessments, and that's where the legal head will come, in as well. Of you want to be very careful not to box people in and label them and forget that
Right.
humans are always growing and changing. So we'll talk a little bit about how to use assessments effectively and then some key communication strategies. And I know that that seems like an overused topic, I guess, right? Is we're always saying, what's the one thing that'll make a difference is communication. But we're talking about, again, using strategic communication that's still authentic and still communicates what you need to. It's like finding ways to reach each other. That's where the assessments also come in. So we'll get into that a little bit as well. And then we're gonna address some of these hot topics, right? We've got still a lot of recovery from the pandemic, and we were
Yes.
talking about this before we went live, right? When we were setting things up and kind of hanging out beforehand, that I'm still seeing a lot of movement around the country with employers having employees that, if they're remote employees, might move, for example, and you might not realize it until it comes time to file a certain form like a W-2. And that might be your first indication when it goes to the wrong address that your employee moved during the year and forgot to tell you, and that may have some consequences. And then we'll talk about things like employee expectations and some of the business challenges in having all of this come together. I think it's a very timely topic with a lot of people entering the job market and looking for work at this point. And then a lot of employers still looking for employees, but being a little bit afraid to spend the money and finding that balance. So we'll address as much of this as possible. But while I'm mentioning that, I should also just point out for those of you that are on the live stream, if you're not familiar with it, you can go right in the comments and it'll show up. It should show up in the chat for us, and we'll be happy to answer your questions live if we can. And some of them may be more appropriate for us to follow up individually. You can schedule consultations. We'll have all that information toward the end. Okay.
And feel free to just type in right now, hi, maybe where you're from,
Yeah.
just to give us a sense that, hey, there are people out there actually listening right now. I feel like I'm in this little box at the moment.
Yeah. Well, isn't that the world we live in now? You're about this big, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So, I want to go now, like, uh, into the conversation about, why this view of partnership really matters, right? I think it can get a little dicey for some people. Lawyers, when they hear partnership, they immediately think, oh my God, I'm not giving my employees part of my business. We're not talking about that kind of partnership. The way I see partnership is it is something that's mutually beneficial, right? So if you start seeing the world that way, it changes your relationships. If you're really going in looking for mutuality, right? That's where we get past those abusive relationships. We've recognized them and we either transform them or we remove them, from our lives so that we're not spending too much time and energy there. And that's whether you're the employer or the employee. And I was just talking to someone last night who is doing a lot of consulting in this area, and he could go on and on. I may have him on the on the webinar in a future month, but he could go on and on about the psychology behind partnership and community and why, just from a human perspective, this is what's missing. That's also why I'm writing a book about why our workplaces aren't working, because I think this is what's missing. And that was why we brought this conversation forward from last month. So, Jeannette, I want to hear from you about creating employment partnerships, you telling some stories about some of the clients you've been working with, what works, what doesn't.
Well, thank you. And thanks from Heidi and Susan and Marjorie for letting us know there are actually people out there listening. Thank you. It does my heart good. I am not someone who can just stand and talk. I have to have it interactive. So feel free to ask questions, ladies. So, anyway, back to in partnerships. I think a lot of things that have happened since the pandemic comes back to the type of people we're hiring, but also our leadership and our bosses. And one of the issues that has come about that to me is just mind boggling is there's a lot of people today that are saying no to leadership and boss positions.
Yeah.
And I think it's kind of scary, to be honest, because we're not providing the current leadership, let alone future leadership, with the communication skills, the financial skills. A lot of them do have the technical skills, but they don't have the emotional intelligence or the social skills. And so when you get into daily work experience or the impact on productivity or the growth potential, we kind of stymie ourselves. We hurt ourselves because we're not being a partnership with not only our employees, but also the boss, also our clients, also the community in which we live in, the industry in which we operate in. And I think that's really, really critical.
And that's a lovely segue into a little observation that I had recently in business generally is when you said the community, the employees, all of it is recognizing that you're always dealing with humans, and that's the element that
Yes.
seems to be missing. It's like, or we remember that some people are human, but we dehumanize others. And,
Yes.
look, this is a grand conversation for the whole world, right? But I saw this play out with a business locally where they came in, they had first of all, they used a brand that was a little controversial and may have been infringing. And then they got in a little trouble that way, but went forward. Then they started alienating people in the community. So they moved into a community that was very diverse. And when I say diverse, those of you that know me know that I worked and continue to work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when I'm saying diverse, I'm talking about groups of people. Individuals are not diverse. That's not code for anything. But they moved into a neighborhood that was it was diverse in religion, race, gender identity, economic status, right? Really like diverse. And then they started alienating certain people within those communities and wondered why their business didn't go well. And so
Right.
I think it's a perfect, again, example of what you're talking about is we forget the human element of it. And that's where we get into trouble financially. If we're not making our employees happy, then they don't produce, they don't deliver the service or the product in the way that the customer wants it, and we just end up closing. And it's really sad because I think the concept of that particular business was good, and I've unfortunately dissolved many a business for
Yeah.
clients that had all the potential but did not have the leadership. And the thing about leadership too is that this born leader thing, that is a myth. You
Yes.
have to train your leaders. It's like, I looked like I was a smart kid, for example, in elementary school. It's because my sisters made me do homework when I was when they were off for the summer and they had to babysit me, they made me sit in a desk and do homework. So I looked like I was ready to lead and be a good student, but it was just because I got a head start. You come out of the womb that way, and no leader does, right?
Right. That's funny. I'd have to blame my mom. She was a teacher, so you know how that works. Yeah,
Yeah, and
I
it
think a
works
lot of
out okay.
times, like getting back to your story there, a lot of times we like to we forget. Let's put it that way, that we have a culture, and when we hire people, we forget one person can really shift that culture. And it might be really minuscule at the moment, but it can actually start to bloom and not necessarily in a good way. sometimes in a good way, sometimes not in a good way. It really depends on the culture. There's cultures out there like, and I ran into one last week where feedback is verboten. They do not appreciate feedback. And I thought, how sad is that?
Yeah.
That's how you grow. That's how you develop. That's how you form partnerships, is knowing I can trust you to support me and let me know, like, ooh, I think you went off the wrong side on that one, or something of that nature. We can all learn. And too often, we focus so much of our time and money on managing, training, and firing. Notice I didn't say hiring, because hiring actually is a lot less expensive than training and developing, coaching, and managing. But we don't take the time to do an ethical or a real job of hiring the right people for the right job. And hence my book, Hire Amazing Employees. It's a step-by-step guide. And Nancy, you've read this. I'll let you chime in as an objective person, because this is my third edition. So I'm probably not as objective as, being the author. But my point being is there's a lot of things that we can do. And it's important that we learn how to do it, because there's so much information out there and so many ideas, or people coming up with these fun, kind of ideas. Or, oh, I know, let's ask the interview question, what's your favorite color? Or what's your favorite movie? And I actually had somebody tell me where she had asked somebody they were interviewing, what's your favorite movie? And the guy responded, Jaws. She ushered him out of there so fast they didn't know what was going on. And I asked him why. And she said, because he's an angry guy. I said, where'd you get that from?
Right.
Because, from a cinematography, I can't even pronounce the word at the moment. Cinematic. There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
It was the first movie that was actually filmed on the ocean.
Yeah.
So, she didn't ask him why he liked that movie.
Well,
so
it could have been his dad took him or his mom. Yeah, as a child, right? You don't know.
Right, but that's how we get ourselves off in the weeds.
Right.
And then when we try to form partnerships, it's kind of hard to do that because there's no authenticity there. There's no transparency there.
Well, and there's also a lot of times a lack of awareness, and which is part of what we covered in last month's webinar, is you have to first understand who you are in your business, right? And recognize how that shows up in creating your culture. Because
exactly,
we're seeing this, to point back to the DEI space, is that a lot of people had what they thought were good intentions, but they hadn't really thought about their commitment to DEI, what that meant for their workplace. They tried to resolve inequities, and like historical inequities that occurred before they were even born. And I said, how about you look at the ones in your workplace that your employees are telling you about? And that's not always where people want to look. And so we have to recognize that culture is not just what you think and what you're trying to create. It's really what your employees tell you they're experiencing, or your clients, your customers, et cetera. And I want to just halt for a second and say, Deborah, you had a question of verboten. So Jeannette used a German word there, which means forbidden. Okay. So I understood that. And sorry about that.
Oops,
but
sorry.
It's verboten is forbidden. And so, yes, there are organizations, and I think we've all been in them, where even if there's an open door policy written in the employee handbook, that you're not supposed to actually use that. And sometimes
there's a lot of I call it mischief. There's a lot of mischief like that out there in companies today. They say one thing, they do another, and the client expects something totally different. And again, that's not a partnership.
Right.
That's a culture that doesn't work.
And Mark brought up something in the comments too about, how difficult it is to maintain that partnership
Yes.
when you're laying people off. And I have experienced something similar. One, because of course I help my clients sometimes when they're having to navigate that. And look, the reality is letting someone go is a difficult experience for everybody involved, and I've written about that. If you can go on my website and even find the post I did a few months ago about that. And part of it is because let's face it, if you're laying people off, you know, in leadership, no matter how much you can blame it on the pandemic or a loss of federal funding or whatever, a tornado or whatever it could be, you can always find an outside influence.
Exactly.
But the reality is, as a business owner, if you didn't set yourself up with some wiggle room, it is still partially your fault. And that's where I think the partnership is very difficult because you're delivering the news and you just want to get this over with. It's already difficult, it's already uncomfortable. And there is a better way to do it, right? There is definitely a better way to do it, even if you don't have, for example, money to pay severance, because severance is not mandatory in most places, right? Unless there's some sort of contract that gives you that.
Or policy.
Or a policy, right? Unless which, has kind of created a contract or an obligation. But if that doesn't exist, which is what most people are going to be dealing with, then you have to go back to what can you offer? And this is
Right.
where the mediation and negotiation skills come in, is, you can start looking at, well, maybe you don't have a lot that you can offer at this point financially, but we forget that when you're offering something and it has value, we're not just looking at monetary value, it's also time and energy. Sometimes helping someone make a transition under those difficult circumstances is one of the kindest and most wonderful things you can do.
It
Yes,
is.
the money would be nice because they don't know if they're going to be able to pay their bills, and a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck, but you don't necessarily have that obligation to fix that end of their life either. You only are in this from a partnership standpoint of, you had a job, you were working together towards some goals. Now you can't continue to do that for whatever reason you're doing the layoffs. So do the humane thing and
Yeah.
help make that transition as comfortable as possible and treat each other with respect. And I have done this myself with employees where I've actually terminated them because they weren't performing well. But when we got into the conversation and I said, can you say honestly that you're doing the best job you can? And one of them specifically said to me, I know I'm not doing the best job I can. I really don't like the work, but I like working for you. And so we laughed about it at that point, said, well, that's not going to work long term. So let's talk about how we're going to, in the spirit of partnership, transform our partnership to where we no longer work together, but we still wish each other well and still will see each other occasionally. If you like me, I like you. That doesn't necessarily mean we should work together.
Exactly. But it really lends itself to what I call a win-win-win relationship.
Right.
You win, I win, the business wins, the clients win, the product service wins, the community wins. Like that's the win-win-win. And I think sometimes we forget that. We want to help people out by giving them a job, but are you really helping them out? Like the example that Nancy spoke about, because it's not a good job. And I call that job fit. And job fit, I think a lot of companies today, and Gallup supports this, that says a lot of people just do not fit their jobs today.
Yeah. And some of that is by just circumstance, right? So many jobs have changed in dramatic ways, and they're going to continue to change. And
Yep.
wow, I know it sounds like I'm plugging myself like crazy, and I apologize for that, but there's so much good stuff going on also. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to be doing a podcast talking about how AI is transforming the future of legal services, for example. And I'm doing that next Wednesday. It's called Technology Revolution. It's at 10 a.m. with Bonnie D. Graham. You can look that up, and we can probably put a link in the notes to the event. But we're talking about that as well, because and that will be in my book about how AI is going to continue to change jobs so quickly and so dramatically that employers are going to have to be thinking about what their jobs are going to look like before they start hiring for them. And
Yeah.
you and I both know this is that a lot of times employers hire way after they needed the help. And I've done that too. I'm guilty.
Or they hire without taking the time to really look at what they really need.
Right.
They've got Joe who left, so we're going to bring Sally over. She can do the job. We assume a lot of stuff, but we don't assess for job fit. And I think that is critical here. It is critical. We're talking 80% of people in today's workplace do not fit the job. And that's sad. It's very sad because we're expecting them to be a partner in keeping clients happy and keeping the teams effective and productive. And yet, if they're not in the right job or they don't feel that they have the resources and tools to do that, then guess what? It's not a good partnership.
Right. And you just gave me some amazing insight that I hadn't really thought about before, that, so many employers will hire somebody based on how they look on paper, how they interview, and,
Yeah.
and their gut, like, oh, I like them, right? And that's fine. We want you to like the people you work with, but first and foremost, they have to be able to perform the essential functions of the job, right? They have to be a good fit.
We hope.
Right? They have to be a good fit for this to be a successful situation. And what I'm realizing as you're talking about this job fit situation and the lack thereof, it explains a lot about why employers have a hard time distinguishing between, for example, employer and employee, is because they kind of treat them all the same. And they expect, like, oh, Nancy looks really good on paper, so she can do all these things because of her job title. I'm going to assume that her job title at that firm is going to be the exact same job as in my firm. But that's where culture comes in. That's where a lot of other pieces come in. And the way I often explain the distinction between employer and I'm sorry, employee and independent contractor is, an independent contractor is the expert. They tell you how they're going to do the job, right? So I think employers a lot of times are kind of wanting the independent contractor, even when they're hiring the employee. It's like, and so you can see where this gets very murky for them and they end up in a lot of trouble. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. It's about how do you assess? So I know you use a particular assessment.
Right.
And I want you to explain a little bit about how that works and how you work with employers to find good job fit.
So the key here is, contrary to popular opinion, is not all assessments are created equally, legally, or scientifically. And the Department of Labor has guidelines available on what does work for pre-employment and promotion purposes. All the rest is fair game as long as you're not impacting somebody's job directly, their paycheck, their title, etc., their job duties. And I think a lot of us create a lot of mischief when we use what's called a 4-quadrant. Everybody knows 4 quadrants, but a lot of assessments out there or derivatives of those assessments. They were not designed for pre-employment purposes. So let me back up just a little bit. So to have a qualified assessment, you need to have reliability. So what a lot of people are doing today that are selling assessments that are technically not appropriate for pre-employment or promotion purposes, they're doing what's called a test retest. All that is reliability. You still have to have a 0.7 or higher. And some of them do. I mean, they ask one or two questions. And if you give the same answers all the time, guess what? They have a very high retest, right? But that's really not playing fair. Let's put it that way. Validity. Are you measuring what you purport to measure? So if somebody is assertive, is that what you're measuring? If somebody is accommodating, are you actually measuring that? Unfortunately, in a lot of the four quadrants, they'll take, if you're real heavy, say, on sociability, they'll collapse that into being competitive, which is not one and the same. So there's where the mischief really begins to happen. And the next thing is called predictive validity. Now, some of them have like a 6-hour window. So you do it on the what we call ipsative test. There's no normative value there, and they say, yeah, they're real high on D, or they're really high on whatever, or they have the letters that go with it. Notice I'm not mentioning any particular assessment because it's not appropriate in this platform. But there are assessments out there that have a predictive validity of 5 years. It's rare, but they're out there. Why is that of value? Because if I'm hiring you to be my partner in sales or in operations or in finance or whatever it is, I want to know I can count on you. Count on the information I'm being given, that who you are today is who you're going to be, or similar to who you're going to be every day you come into work. I'm sure all of you have heard of the times where somebody interviews real well, you hire them, and then 2 days or 2 weeks later, they go, what was I thinking? In fact, last week I met a woman, and the new hire lasted 2.5 hours before she said, I'm out of here. This ain't working. And then the last piece is on distortion. Are they actually telling you who they really are? And a lot of companies are using tools that are not appropriate for pre-employment, and candidates know that. And they'll go, yep, I can make that thing look any way I want. That, again, is not a good mark of a tool. So if you're not using the appropriate tools, if you're relying real heavily on a resume where 80% of the time you have inaccuracies, or you're relying on interviews before you're hiring people, and the stat with that is 90% of people rely on that interview, 90%, instead of going due diligence a third, a qualified assessment a third, and then the interview a third. So if you do one third, you're going to have a pretty good overview. And that's how you collect also objective data. So
it's also how you avoid implicit bias.
What that does
is reduce the opportunity for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it reduces bias, but it helps you. It also makes you have to start to look and say, why am I hiring this person? Mm-hmm. Because if you have a job fit of 25% when the norm or the average is 80%, what were you really interviewing for? Clearly, that person isn't going to fit the job. But if you're hiring somebody because you're really anxious about getting the position filled, is that really a true partnership? Is that a win-win-win? It really is not. And then we get upset because we hire for subjective reasons, but then we fire for poor job fit.
Right.
So I don't know. It's one of those things where you can define with clarity what you need, have an honest self-assessment of what it is you really need and want in this person. That could be just wanting to show up on time every day. Well, that's something to have a conversation about. And then, are you using objective criteria? And most employers are not. So again, when you're bringing the person in, there's already this disconnect on a true partnership, in my opinion.
No, and I can tell you as an employment attorney that you're hitting a lot of what I see when cases end up in my office or in some sort of administrative agency with a complaint, et cetera. That's what I'm usually seeing. Is it's not that people are necessarily terrible people. It's usually that there was there was miscommunication all the way along. So it started with the employer not having a clear idea of what they were hiring for. And I understand that. Look, as a small employer myself, I like to reserve the and any other duties assigned, right? And I get that, right? You want to have that
A
freedom.
little catch-all phrase.
Of course, and I understand that, I understand why we use that. I do use it myself, but I also know that I have a responsibility to figure out if those other duties as assigned are actually in the wheelhouse of the employee. And I've learned the hard way, right? Like, look, I've been around for 23 years now, so I've made my share of mistakes. And before I became a lawyer, I worked in operations and I worked for other people, right? So, look, I've learned. And bottom line is what I see now is it starts there where the employer is just looking for kind of a warm body, or something I've also done is I have hired out of sympathy.
Yeah.
Somebody I knew lost their job. I needed help with something, so I hired them, right? And as I've written about that as well, sympathy is not a good basis for hiring. Because the other thing is immediately in this conversation of partnership, you can even hear it, right? Is
Correct.
that if I'm thinking I'm giving you something because I'm giving you an opportunity or something, I'm already seeing I have this and you're down here. So it's like, it's a little mafiosa almost of like, you owe me, right? It's like,
Well,
it's
and
no,
it doesn't fit the win-win-win. There's no
exactly.
winners
That's
in
not
that.
partnership, right?
You've taken the person out of the employment arena to find a job where they would be a good fit, where they
Right.
would feel good about going to the job each day, where they would feel proud, like, look what I achieved.
Right. And then you think about that as like that particular employee, for example, that I had the conversation and we offboarded her. She went on to do what she loves. And every time I see
Yeah.
her doing what she loves, it makes my heart full. And vice versa. She sees me doing what I love. We're getting things done. And that wouldn't have happened if we had destroyed each other by holding on, just like any other relationship you hold on to that needs to,
Right.
transform.
So did you
So
see the question about the probationary period?
I do. You wanna take it or would you like me to take
Well,
it?
I think we can both take it because
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily a proponent of it. Because to me, it's kind of like, okay, we're going to just test you out here because our hiring system really doesn't work. So we're going to hire you to see if you actually do work out, as opposed to really taking it upon ourselves, being responsible, being accountable for making sure we have a hiring system that works. If it does, then chances are very good that the person's going to work out. If they don't, part of that's just called, being in business, right? What are your
Yeah,
thoughts about that, Nancy?
it's interesting because I think it also sends a negative message that it says, "Well, come on in. We're committed to you. You get the whole orientation, welcome, everything else, but," right? And it's like it just shuts it off, right? And so I don't like the message that that sends. The other thing that I remind people on both sides, whether you're an employer or an employee, you're always on a probationary period, because probationary period for me says, it's kind of like dating. Go and wear your best outfit, look your best, be on, don't talk about this, talk about that, do your P's and, mind your P's and Q's. Put it all out there in a polished way. Don't let them see who you really are for that probationary period of 3 months. And that's on both sides they do that. So again, that's not going to create a partnership. What you need to do is just be honest with yourselves and each other and look for a fit, because you're going to spend a heck of a lot of
Yeah.
time together. If you're looking at a full-time position, for example, you're gonna spend a lot of time together, even if it's on Zoom or, you're doing remote work, you're still going to be working together, so make sure that you're a good fit.
But I think it also lets us off the hook of really being focused on training and developing people.
Yep.
So if we've done a good job of hiring, which is actually less costly than the training and developing period, and if you're hiring for job fit, which means the chances of them really enjoying their job and taking it on like a duck takes to water, a duck just naturally learns to swim. They don't throw the duck in the middle of the lake and say, okay, now let's see if you can swim or not. No, we're there. The mother ducks there helping to coach the baby ducks into doing that. And I think if we take that on, like, okay, we know the strengths and weaknesses because every strength has a weakness, every weakness has a strength. We know what they need to do to be coachable. We've asked the question in the interview. We asked them about what was the mistake you made, and if they say no, we sort of ushered them out. But if we got good people who are honest that, yeah, I did make this mistake and this is how I corrected it, and they are coachable, guess what? That's a good employee. Will they make it past 90 days? Probably. But we want somebody who on the 100th day says, I love working here. And there isn't all of a sudden a different person showing up for work.
Yeah, well, and I think that you mentioned that earlier about this, kind of 5-year type assessment, and I think that's another thing that I see on the litigation end and the conflict in workplaces. It's that we expect them to, like, well, 5 years, you're supposed to, it says right here in the assessment, for 5 years, you're gonna be this person. Like, we forget that
Yeah,
people
people
get sick.
change. People can
Yeah, people
change.
change. Their life circumstances change. We're going to be seeing that currently.
Yeah.
I'm already seeing it where spouses are losing their jobs, and if you can work remotely, you might move with your spouse to a new state, and that is wonderful in many ways, but there's gonna be a lot of movement, and that's another reason we thought this was a very timely topic, is you can't expect to just hire somebody like they're a robot or a piece of machinery. And look, even your machinery, especially if you've invested the amount, like if you have invested, for example, $60,000 in a piece of equipment, wouldn't you maintain that equipment, make sure you knew how to keep it in good repair, keep it working well? And yet we don't treat our employees that way. We
We
treat
don't.
our employees worse than we treat our machines.
Well, we do. And I would like to go back to your point because I've seen this happen way too often, particularly with people moving around the country. So, and this is a true story where a woman did a really fabulous job. I'll make up a state called Arizona. That's not true, but to hide the innocent or guilty, however you want to look at that. And she was in sales. But how that sales job was defined was that people would call her, she'd process the sales. Now, she had been there a long time. So, of course, people talked very nicely about her because she was a really nice person. If you needed something done, she made it happen. Well, then she decided she wanted to move to Alabama, again, not the real state, to be with her dad because he was going through, dementia stuff, and to support her mom in that process. So she talked the employer into moving her to that state in sales. Well, guess what? He was expected to open up a new territory, and she failed miserably because that real nice customer service, real helpful kind of attitude that was really successful, that's what made her a success, didn't work when you're out there networking, asking for presentations, closing the sale. Those are not skills she had in that kind of environment. Plus, there's a difference between the Southwest and the Southeast. Again, we're talking culturally. And I think we're going to start hearing more and more about that, where people say, well, I moved here from Michigan to Colorado. True story for me. There is a difference in culture. You could move from Detroit up to Grand Rapids in Michigan, and it's going to be a different culture. A lot of times we just don't take that into account. And so as a result, we're not forming or maintaining a good partnership.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on some it brings us right into the communication practices. You're hitting on some of the key things also about recognizing that anytime you move, like, look, even if you're just moving to a different business across town,
Yeah.
right? There's going to be a different culture there, and you need to learn what that is, right? And it doesn't mean that cultures aren't going to be continuing to change too, and that's where the communication is so key. And you said something earlier that I want you to repeat that I think is super relevant here, and that you made the comment about people hire for subjective reasons and fire for more objective reasons, called like performance, right?
Or job fit. Yeah.
Yeah, for poor job fit. And I think that is just, I saw that in your newsletter when it went out today, and I thought, what a wonderful way of putting that, because that is it. We end up ultimately making those decisions based on our gut when we have that, that decision to make. And that's where matrices and things like that also come in, is like try to make things as objective as possible. And even in communication, I do that, right? Like when I'm mediating, I say, let's get down to what is the disagreement? So Jeanette and I disagree about X, not Jeanette's a bad person and I'm a great person. It's what do we disagree about? And maybe we disagree about who's good and who's bad. That's fine too. Let's dig into that, right? But I try to get into like something that's pretty succinct. And
Oh my goodness, my
uh-oh, in
apologies.
demand.
My apologies. Those spammers. Oh my goodness. Wow, there we go. Woo.
See, what you were supposed to say is, I am in such demand. They're calling me in the middle of this.
Yeah, those spammers love me. I'm in high demand. But to go back to your point, though,
Yeah.
a lot of times we focus on managing for somebody's personality. We're not managing for the results. And I think we expect people to change. People don't change. They can, but they don't change dramatically. So you're not going to take an introvert and make them an extrovert, or take a high sociable person and make them a super good listener. Can they improve their listening skills? Absolutely. But to the point where they're a great listener and you want them as a consultant, or I'm sorry, counselor and maybe a rehab place, probably not. So there's things like that that sometimes we have to get real about. We have to get real about.
And I agree, without making people wrong about who they are too. And I think that's the other part
Yeah,
of it, is because a lot of times the employer then wants to put it back on the employee and it's like, no,
exactly.
no, you missed it in your assessments. And this is again, in the spirit of partnership, you both did this, right?
Exactly. Reminds me of a client who years ago called me up, and they've been using the assessment for years, the one that I rep and have for over 32 years, and has the highest, it literally, objectively is considered the granddaddy of assessments. And she called me up and said, this person is driving me nuts. He's creating mischief. He's creating problems with clients, et cetera, et cetera. So I always start with the assessment. And I said, okay, let's look and see what's going on. And I said, well, from the assessment perspective, he's the right person for the job from what you said. And she goes, well, he's doing all this stuff that's not part of his job description. I said, well, that happens a lot of times in businesses where employees take on a little something extra here, a little something extra there, or because of a situation, they take on something outside of what they fit, and part of the job that is not a good fit. But instead of like, it's a one-off, it becomes part of their everyday job, and that's where they get themselves in trouble.
Right.
So I said to her, I said, you have a choice here. You can either let him go, or you can work with him to help him become successful, which means you pull back into the job he's been hired to do, and that we know he can do, and he has proven himself to do, and help him to improve his communication skills. And she goes, oh, I hadn't really thought about it that way. Because too often it's like success out the door. He's okay, but that person's out the door. And that's where you get brought in, Nancy, on mediating these kind of situations. that if people learn to communicate, be more supportive of one another in a real objective manner, that would make a big, huge difference.
Exactly. And then I got into a conversation online over the weekend with a gentleman that talked about, like, we have to remember that, we acknowledge people's lived experiences, right? We want to acknowledge someone's lived experience and respect that they're unique
Yep.
and individual, but we also have to remember that someone's lived experience is subjective. So by pulling in objective criteria, like a job description, like key performance indicators, take some of that emotional component
Yep.
away so that you're both making really good decisions. And I will say, I do hold employers to higher standards for that, because who knows what you need in your business, or who should know better but you? And that's exactly how
Exactly.
the law is going to look at you. So it really is on you. It doesn't mean the employees are off the hook, right? Employees, you need to be looking internally as well and understanding your own strengths. And Jeannette and I both have resources for that. But if you're putting yourself in a situation, as a lot of employees do, just for the salary, and you're lying to get the salary, look, you're going to be found out, right? It's always like, even some people do rise to the occasion, but you have to know that if you're going in with a deficit and you're kind of fudging a little bit to get up to a level for a promotion or a higher level of salary, then you better on the back end, when in your free time, be doing what you need to do to develop yourself professionally to meet that standard, because otherwise you're going to end up with a termination on your record.
Yeah.
And
Wasn't it
that's not good
Peter?
for anybody
Wasn't
either.
it Peter Drucker that's he's a management guru, for those of you who probably don't recognize the name, said something to the effect of that we promote people to their level of incompetence.
Yeah.
And it's really sad because we know better. This
But
isn't something we don't know. We know better, but yet we
it,
continue doing it, and then we act surprised that they can't do the job. But we didn't do our homework in making sure that that partnership would be a good one.
right, because even that is behavioral largely, right? You
Yeah.
promote someone to their level of incompetence, and then what do? You make them competent. You train them, you
If you
develop them.
can, if you can. I mean, if it's not the right job for a person, like a lot of times people take their number 2 person and make them number 1,
Right.
and they fail miserably. Why? Because they were really great as a number 2 person. They might think they're good as a number 1, but they actually don't have what it takes to be number 1.
Yeah. Yeah, and especially if you're not going to invest in them. And I think
Exactly.
that's the thing that I always tell employers is, no matter what, even your employee who comes in, does their job quietly, and you barely have to even worry about them, even that employee needs to be developed. And good employers, what I've found, will have these performance development or professional development plans for all their employees. And they're rather passive to some degree, but you will be able to identify who is management material, and management material is not just capacity currently, but who has the drive to develop what they need to. And I think that's something that most employers will tell you. They hire for that more than anything. It's the attitude, it's the enthusiasm, I'm trying to remember how somebody put it, the natural curiosity. I don't know
Yeah.
how natural it is. I think we're all a little bit curious, but naturally curious about the work that you're doing. If they're naturally curious about something else, that's awesome, but maybe help them go find a job in that.
Absolutely. So let's move on to our last slide here.
All right. So I think
So
we've
partnership mindset, I think, is really, really critical. And it begins with you as the employer. It doesn't begin with them. If you've done a great job of asking the right job related questions, ensuring that they can take feedback, are coachable. They know, and you have an environment where mistakes aren't, I don't know that they're welcomed, but they're also doesn't mean that they're going to lose their job necessarily. Again, it depends on the mistake. But if you're doing a great job with the hiring, and then you're doing a fabulous job with the onboarding, the training and development, and continually giving them more according to who they are and what they're interested in, that to me is a great partnership. But it first starts with making sure you've got the right objective data when you hire the person. You're having straight interview conversations. And I see a lot of people get really weird on those interviews. Oh my goodness gracious. Even if they're given good interview questions, they don't ask them all because they, for whatever reason, their ego gets in the way. But again, there's so much out there that can support the process. Embrace it. That's what's the start of a great partnership.
Yeah, always. Every partnership, right? You have to do that exploration, and then the other part that I say, respect is non-negotiable.
Yeah.
And that is not only your commitment to respecting the people that work for you, but using that as also a kind of a thermometer. The moment that you can no longer look at other people in your workplace, certain employees, as somebody you value, stop yourself. Maybe it is that you need to talk to somebody about what's going on. And an exercise I often give people is, in that moment that you're having a hard time humanizing and respecting that other person, I want you to write down 10 things you think that they contribute to your workforce, right? And that starts to put you in a different conversation, right? That way, if they are at the level of their incompetence, you can start to uncover it and remember that this is a human being that deserves to be treated with respect. And you're not going to get it if you're not respecting them, right? So it's a two-way conversation, which is again why we talk about partnership.
Well, it's also the opportunity that if you keep having those kind of thoughts and feelings, to hire yourself a good executive coach to help you walk through those kind of situations. Because sometimes we ourselves hit that ceiling, and in order to go through it, we're not going to get through it on our own. And again, I've seen people that have gone from so employees and hire a good coach. I'm going to raise my hand on that one, but a good coach actually go through that ceiling and actually become fabulous. But
And
it
that's a
takes
really
that
good
commitment. It takes that partnership. It takes everybody being committed to each person's success, and that includes yours.
And I love that you brought that up too about they're hitting their ceiling too. And I think we forget that, right? That even if you're running your own business, I am always growing. I'm always like,
Yep.
maybe not growing the business, maybe not growing in number or finances, but I'm always growing personally in order to meet the demands of the workplace. So I will say that this is my call for anybody that's really in a management situation right now. It is my call to action to you is that you consider having a coach so that you're not needing me as
Yeah.
a lawyer, right? Have somebody. There are plenty of them with different structures that you
Yeah.
maybe use them only when you're stuck, right? It's fine, right? It's it's better than staying stuck and making big mistakes. So I want to open. I know we've been really chatty, and I know we've been answering some of the questions from the chat. But if you all have any specific questions at this point, now's a great time to pop them in the chat, and we'll be happy to answer them. I'm willing to stay on for a few minutes to make sure that you're taken care of.
Well, while we're waiting to see if there are any questions, I'll tell you a good story about the value of a coach. There was a business that hired me, and they didn't know if they should fire the guy or promote the guy. True story. You went like, oh my goodness. And so I talked with him. I used the assessment. I said, no, he definitely has the capability. So I worked with him for 10 weeks, and guess what? He got promoted.
Uh-huh.
he got promoted, all because he had the person who was 150% for his success. But here's what we focused on: communication, 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 communication. And I think a lot of times, I don't care how old you are, because I've worked with older people and younger people, the common denominator that I focus on is communication.
Well, we think that people are going to communicate the way that we do.
Exactly.
And that communication is always gonna land the way that we intended it. And you know, you and I could go into a whole different
That's
conversation.
a whole nother hour or two
Right, a
or
whole
three.
nother hour about being responsible for your communication, but you have to remember that it's not just about you delivering it, it's you delivering it in a way that can be received. And so if it's not received, you didn't communicate. You just said something.
That's
And
a
what a
great
I think that's a great, like, boom, mic drop.
Okay, any questions? We got just a little over a minute left.
Yeah, it looks like no questions. So just want to point out for those of you that maybe turned away, reading some email, whatever, and you're listening in the background, our contact information, our websites are up on the screen, so you can reach me, of course, at 30 or Conflict Resolution, and you can reach Jeannette at Seibco LLC. So
Or
thank you so
Seibco.com.
much. Yes, and Seibco.com. So thank you so much for coming. I hope you found value in this, and reach out if we can help you, because we're all growing and changing all the time. We're trying to form a new paradigm with business and
Yes.
workplaces, and we really do believe that that's possible, and we've seen it. We're doing it every day. So the more that we can have people like you on board and spread that word and give you skills, the better it gets for all of us.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.